Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Glad you all made it to this room. I was surprised that there's so many people turning up because this is on a conference that talks about code in every talk. This might be a bit of off topic because I'm going to talk about requirements. I'm going to talk about modeling requirements. I'm going to talk about Agile. I'm going to talk about a bit of coding, some software architecture, some code generation, and so it's not. A lot of these talks are about, okay, this is the technology, and here's how you can use it. Like if you go to, I went to the knockout session before, and so Alan explained about knockout, and I'm not going to explain a particular product to you. I am going to use some products that we use in most of our projects, like modeling tools, like code generation tools. So it's a bit of everything. So bear with me. This is originally a 75-minute talk. The last few times I did it, a month ago in Vienna and last week in the Netherlands, I did it in 45 minutes. So I had to find all the slides again that I had originally in the talk and pull them back in. So I might have some time to do, now it's a 90-minute talk, to do extra stuff to show you a bit more of the details of how we do things in projects. I hope you enjoy it. Basically, that's it. So let's start. Anybody of you who's seen my talks earlier this week, such as the opening keynote and the talk I did yesterday on frameworks? Okay. So that means there is some slides in here that I had in either one of these talks already, but it's only a few, so bear with me. Okay, so for the rest of you, if this thing works, for the rest of you who didn't see me already, my name is Sander. I won't pronounce my, well, I will try to pronounce my last name. In English, you would probably say Hoogendoorn, and in Dutch, because I'm Dutch, we say Hoogendoorn, which is a horrible sound in English. I know the sound doesn't make it really well in the English language, but anyway. So I work for Capgemini, which is an extremely large company. We employ about 140,000 people worldwide, of which there are about 6,000 in the Netherlands and about 35,000 people in India, for instance. So it's a big company. And big companies work with other big companies, as we do. So what we have done over the years is we have gathered a whole bunch of techniques that we can apply to mostly Agile projects, but not always Agile projects, and that help us, well, speed up the development a little bit and automate some stuff that you otherwise have to do manually and get better quality out of that. And I'm going to show you a bit about that. And there's techniques in there that you can easily apply to your own projects. There's some tooling that I will be using. Some of that tooling is just for sale, not from Capgemini, but from other vendors like modeling tools. There's a code generator I will be using, which is called Tobago, which my team and I built over the years. And you can just download it from the website. And we're building a new website for it, but the old website's a little bit, well, you can see if you go there. But anyway, so I'm also one of our global Agile thought leaders, for whatever that may mean. That means I try to, with some other people, try to grab together what Capgemini thinks about Agile. The thing is with Agile, it is different from project to project. It is different from organization to organization. Anybody who is doing Agile does that in their own way, and that's how it's intended to be, right? So don't see what I will be presenting as the way of doing Agile. It's a way of doing Agile. And it's a way that works for us. And then again, we work with large clients, right? So I'm also a developer, as I'll show you, and I'm also a dad. I have 3 kids who all wanted to come with me to London, but have to go to school, so they're not here. I've written some books, some articles. I do speak at occasions, such as here. This is my personal blog. It has a lot of blogs out there. Some of the stuff, some of the more detailed stuff that I will be presenting today, I've written that down on a lot of blog posts, which you can find on my blog. This is my Twitter hashtag. If you feel the need to tweet about this thing, feel free to do that. And otherwise, I'll do it myself. If you have quick questions afterwards, by the way, because this is the last day of the conference, and I have the job of keeping you awake after lunch, which is usually a hard thing to do, you can best ask me through Twitter, because I'll look at that continuously, and no, not during the talk, but after the talk, and I can get back to you soon. So, these are my books, and okay, blah, 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 because you've all seen that already. This is the book that's in English, will be coming out, hopefully, well, I hope to have it out next week. depending on the last jobs that my editor still has to do on it. Yeah, well, we'll see what happens. It will be available on Amazon at first in the US, and then we'll see how it grows from there. And there will be a Kindle version and whatever you need. Right. So this is basically the agenda for today. It's quite a number of topics. So I'll talk a bit about Agile and how Agile works. And I'll ask you first how many of you are doing Agile projects. So as everybody is doing that already, I can do that really quickly, the introduction, right? And then I'm going to talk about requirements in Agile projects. I'm going to be talking about where the backlog comes from, how you can fill it, a bit about how you can do estimation. Slightly different from what you might be used to, but it's there's multiple approaches to do this, right? And then I'm going to talk about something called smart use cases. It's a way of doing requirements a little bit more structured than you would expect from user stories. I'm actually going to show you some of the models that we have from projects. I'm going to talk about the different levels of use cases and different levels of requirements, about standardizing that stuff, also about estimating those. And then I'm going to show you a bit about how to automate this stuff and actually how to create code from the use cases as well, and using code generation on the fly. So this is basically it. There will be some demos. They will be more and more to the end. And since I've got more time probably to spend than I usually do on this talk, I'll probably can show you a bit about how these tools work and what we've done with it extra to make them work in our favor, etc., etc. So if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to ask. The amount of time we have is long enough to do that. And otherwise, I'll be here for the rest of the day to answer any other questions. So, who of you is in an Agile project? Aha, that's good. So that's about 60%, I'd say. So that's good. The thing with Agile is there is no single approach to Agile. Those of you who have seen my keynote on Monday? Was it Monday? Tuesday, right, it was Tuesday. Well, I talked about that already. And the thing is, in any project, in any given team, in any organization, things that work there might not work in another project. That's the way it is, right? Every project is different, every team is different, every setup, every set of roles that you might have in projects is different. But basically, I am going to show you a bit about why Agile works, how it works. And I have to excuse myself for, these pictures actually come from my book. Some of them are already in English, and some of them still have some Dutch words in it. If they do, I'll translate them for you. I'll probably get the English version of the pictures later on, and I'll replace them in my talk, but this still has some of the Dutch pictures in that, right? So basically, an Agile project usually starts with a backlog. And a lot of these Agile approaches just say, okay, you're going to start the project, the backlog is already there, right? So the backlog is basically a list of the things that you can do to get to the end of the project. It's the functionality that you need to build. It's the other work items that you need to do, such as set up your development environment, set up a test environment, think about UI guidelines and whatever you might have. Think about a baseline architecture, getting your requirements out, stuff like that. So there's basically, I would say, two types of work items in projects. It's the functional work items, the stuff that you need to build to get out to the user, and everything that's around there that you need to do to make sure that your project is running, right? So that's the backlog. Every Agile project, independent of the approach that you use, so whether you use like Scrum or XP or Smart or DSDM or OpenUp or Crystal Clear or Evo or whatever Agile approach you might have, they all have the same principles. That is, excluding one, which is Kanban, which is actually not an Agile approach. It's a slightly different approach. It's actually an approach to improve on the processes you are already using. So that's a slightly different way of looking at it. But every Agile approach out there basically does the same thing. You split up the time you have to get to the end of the project into iterations. In Scrum, you would call that sprints. Scrum has, for me, a slightly different way of working than I would prefer in Agile project, is that every sprint in Scrum is considered to be a small project, right? It has a start, it has an end, and at the end of the sprint, you have sort of finished a small project. So every sprint, again, is a small project. I usually work in a fashion that I don't consider my iterations, because I prefer to talk about iterations, to be a complete project. The thing is, if you do complete projects, every month you will get tired. It's projects put you under stress, right? It would be the same thing if you have Usain Bolt, who is faster than anybody else on the planet on the 100 meters dash. If you would ask him to do the 800 meters in 8 sprints of 100 meters, right? So the world record for the 100 meters dash is like, I don't know, 960 or something. So if you would say, okay, if that is the world record on the 100 meters dash, then you could probably say, okay, if I do 8 of these, then I would have the world record on the 800 meters, which you don't, because it needs additional time, right? So it's tough to be in a new project every month or every 2 weeks, as most people do. So I usually consider them slightly more binding as in the contract way of speaking about binding. Let's say, okay, I'm going to define here what I'm going to do, and I'm going to finish that exactly at that point in time. That is very hard to come up with the exact amount of work that you can do in such a mini project, right? So we usually say, okay, we're going to work on these work items. We'll try to get them finished, but it's not the end of the world if we don't finish all of them. So not like if I have 8 work items defined that I want to do, and I finish 7, I'm pretty content about that. And the 8th one, well, we'll bring it up in the next sprint or the next iteration, right? So it's less a way of getting these mini projects out. So every iteration has the same structure, basically, in any of these Agile approaches. So here come some Dutch words. Well, you'll probably be able to recognize them anyway. So English and Dutch have the same root, and so does German, by the way. But I'm not going to talk in German. It's a different language, right? So every iteration starts with basically a kickoff, right? And whether you call that the sprint planning meeting or the planning game or just a kickoff, I don't really care about that. What I do care about is trying to figure out what work will we be doing during the next iteration. And I'm, as I said, less rigid about that than most Scrum projects are. I'm just going to say, okay, we know about more or less the amount of work that we can do during an iteration, so we're just going to plan more or less that amount of work, and we're going to try cleaning up that amount of work and move on to the next iteration. So at the end of each iteration, every Agile approach evaluates. In Scrum, there's different meetings for that. They are called the sprint, whatever they call it, the sprint, well, yeah, you have the retrospective and the sprint demo, whatever. I always forget those two, but basically you do 2 things, right? The first thing is you evaluate what you have done. So the work that you've done should be evaluated by, well, let's say everybody in teams. So usually what teams do is they do a demo. And doing demos is okay, but it also, there's a risk involved in that. So giving a demo is good because everybody can see, all the stakeholders for your project can see what you've been doing, right? And I just missed the retrospective on my project because I'm here, because they actually do it today. And they're going to show, this is actually the first iteration in this particular project, and they're actually going to show what they have built over the last 2 weeks. Not that much because it's starting up and it's a big project, so we had to settle a lot of things, and it's a Java project, so it's going slow anyway, and well. Is anybody of you doing Java, by the way? Okay, yeah, me too, I have to. No, that's just being a bit of sarcasm, right? Sorry? Yeah. I would prefer C# over Java, by the way. But anyway, so you evaluate what you've done, and maybe even more important, you evaluate the way that you've done it, right? The thing is, in an Agile project, is that you try to learn continuously. You try to improve on what you do every iteration again and again and again. And that's totally different from being in a waterfall project, where they usually, if they do at all, evaluate at the end of the project, which is, in my opinion, totally useless. Because the project has already ended. So there's nothing more we can improve on the project. And then people usually say, usually project managers, they say, yeah, or managers even in the organization say, well, we have to learn from this for the next project. Well, I've been in this industry for 3 decades, and it didn't make much sense to me, and I haven't learned much from evaluations at the end of the project. The next project, we will probably make the same mistakes again and again and again, as I have witnessed over these 3 decades. So you evaluate at the end of the iteration. So the big question is, how much work can you put into the next iteration? So this, again, is Dutch, right? This is the Dutch word for project. And this is the Dutch word for iteration, right? It's pretty much the same again. So this is a very tough job. And there's teams out there that spend tons of time in just trying to figure out what they can actually do during the next iteration. If you go into a typical Scrum project, well, let's say typical because, well, as you've seen my keynote, Scrum itself does not tell you how to do this, right? So what most people do in a Scrum project, they pick up the backlog items and they cut them up into tasks, right? Who of you is doing that? Okay. And then usually what teams do, but there's no law that you have to do this like this, is they try to estimate the individual tasks in hours, right? And then see if that actually fits the 2-week or the 4-week period you have for that. I've seen teams struggle with that, sometimes taking even a full day out of the 2-week sprint to be able to find out how much work you can actually do. So to me, that is a bit overdone. Let's put it like this. So as I have 90 minutes, I will dive a little bit deeper into the issues that you might have with this stuff. So there's 3 options. So if you are able to decide exactly how much work you can do in the iteration, and it exactly fits, which is very hard, you're fine. But if you, in all your wisdom, decide to do less work than you could actually do, which is a strange idea, by the way, but there's some risks involved in that. The first risk is actually called Parkinson's Law. Have you heard of Parkinson's Law before? Parkinson's Law says that the work you have expands in the time available, right? So if you do one thing and you have 2 weeks to do, you will actually spend 2 weeks in doing that. Especially if you're in a Java project, because what people then will do, they'll write a framework. Actually, just got into a Java project, right? And this is my first Java project in at least 12 years. So I've been doing .NET projects in the last 12 years and a lot of stuff. And the last Java project I did before that, that was the time when Java programmers were still scarce. They were very expensive. And this particular project was a waterfall project, and they had 20 Java developers on the team. But being at a waterfall project, they haven't got around to programming yet, because they still needed to finish the analysis and the design and whatever they do. But they hired them already, right? Because, yeah, well, you couldn't get Java developers back then. So there were 20 Java developers having nothing to do. And you can imagine what they did. They wrote a framework. They wrote a big framework. There were class diagrams on the wall of that particular project that sort of ranged from here to there, like a meter's high, and they had like 6,000 classes projected on the diagram, right? That was their framework that they built. So the longer you keep them doing nothing, the bigger the framework will get. And after we started building in that project, it took them 6 weeks to get 2 forms out with 20 programmers. Isn't that cool? So anyway, so the other issue you might have is something called student syndrome. You're probably all familiar with that, right? Student syndrome is the idea that if you know that you don't have enough work, you will push it away until the last couple of days. The analogy with studying is, of course, that if you have an exam in 2 weeks, you won't do anything until the day before, right? Or even the night before, as I usually did that. And then you will get into trouble because you have too much work to do in a few days. And this happens in projects as well. What you see is that usually people in organizations, they have all sorts of other stuff to do, right? Application maintenance and some other stuff, or people walk into the door and say, oh, could you help me out with this? And then the guys on the team say, oh, yeah, we're good in time, so I'm going to help you. And they're away for half a day. And the last 3 days in the iteration, they have to work like crazy to get the stuff done. I've even seen Agile projects where I thought that the amount of work that they picked for an iteration was quite okay. And still, every iteration, again and again, they worked over the last weekend, which is totally pointless, right? So that's if you have too little work in your iteration. Having too much work in your iteration also doesn't work. Why? Well, basically, if you do that a few iterations after each other, people will get demotivated. I actually did sort of a social experiment in a project once, where we said, like, okay, this is the amount of work that we want to do during this iteration, knowing that it was a little bit too much. Because we were just interested in how the team would respond. And how they responded was that their first reaction was, we cannot get the work done. The iterations need to be 3 weeks instead of 2. And I was just like, okay, we're not going to do that. So we did that 3 iterations after each other, and they got really demotivated. So the conclusion I drew from that is that if you put too much work on a team, they will be unhappy. I was coaching a client last year, and they were doing Scrum, and they wanted to move on to, let's say, beyond Scrum. But they had some troubles with doing Scrum. The thing was that they were not that good at estimating how much work they could actually do in an iteration or in a sprint. And then again, the other mistake they made is that they only estimated the work from the developers, not the work from the product owner, not the work from the testers, not the work from the analyst that they had, the business analyst. So they actually estimated totally wrong. And they had 6 sprints in a row where they didn't meet the deadline, because Scrum basically has a deadline right at the end of your sprint. And they refer to that as red sprints. I thought that was a nice phrase to do. Yeah, we have 6 red sprints in a row. So what does that mean? Well, that means we're not really successful, which wasn't true in my opinion, because they still did a lot of work. They just didn't finish everything that they had planned to do, but they did a lot of work, and they progressed really good. So I said to them, just pick a little bit more work, and you'll be fine. And they were. So I could go again, right? This was like a 2-hour consultancy job. So that's good. So you have to pick the right amount of work, right? So that's basically how you do it. And then the thing is, how do you do the work? So if you see starting Agile teams that just moved into Agile, and there still is a lot of teams, especially in large organizations and government bodies that actually just start to do this, they will actually, if you move from the waterfall into an Agile way of working, what they will do is the following. So if this is my iteration, I'll draw it a little bit big. They will actually apply, especially in Scrum, because in Scrum every sprint, again, is a sort of a mini project. They will actually apply waterfall to the sprint, right? So if I choose, let's say, 3 work items, they will start doing the requirements for that, then they'll do the analysis for that, then they'll do the design, and then they start building the stuff, and at the end, they will stop testing it, and then hopefully it goes into, well, let's say into production, just to make it nice, right? So they'll apply a mini waterfall. And the thing is, it's still waterfall, right? It's still the model where you do everything only once. Which means, if you're, even if you work hard, your requirements take longer to investigate. This is what will happen. So this takes longer. Well, this will move, and it probably also takes longer. And then after analysis, we do design. So design also takes a bit longer. And then we start building this stuff. Oh, and then we're at the end of the sprint. As a result, I probably have some nice design documents, maybe some use cases totally written out or whatever, but I haven't got a single line of working code. So this is a risk that actually a lot of starting teams are dealing with in Agile. So the thing is, what you should actually do is actually do the work items one by one. So this is work item 1, then work item 2, and then work on work item 3. The thing is, if I now run into trouble, and it takes me more time to do the individual work items, let's say, oh, I'm going a bit cross now, and so this is work item 1 and 2 and 3, and then my time's up, that means I at least have delivered work items 1 and 2, right? So I have progressed. So you do it on a work item basis, and that's slowly when you move into, let's say, beyond Scrum, because if you do it in a work item by work item fashion, you are slowly moving into slightly more Kanban-like projects, right? And we've experimented that for years and years, and to us that works a bit better. So my tip here is do it work item by work item. And then all the stuff that you need to do, like the analysis and design, and you have to build it and test it and get it done, right? So get your definition of done in order. Do it work item by work item. So what's next? So the next thing is, Agile is, well, let's put it in the words of Ken Beck, it's embracing change. So you allow your project to change, right? You allow your requirements to change. You allow new requirements to the project. If you do that in a waterfall project, the project will get into trouble. Well, basically not, because they don't plan for changes, right? So what they do usually in a waterfall project is they fill in a change request form. You've all seen them, right? And they put them on a pile, and when the project is done, if it's ever done, they'll pick up this huge stack of change requests and start working on those. That is not a really efficient way of doing things, because if you do a longer running project, let's say your project runs for a year, that means that you will have, at the end of the year, if your project succeeds, you will have built what you figured out at the start of the project, right? And the world changes over that year. And you have not met any of these changes because you just bend them out, right? So in an Agile project, any Agile approach, that works differently. So as soon as you identify a new requirement, and I shouldn't have named it I, because I also stands for iteration, but anyway, maybe in the next book I'll name it K or whatever. And so you find a new work item. The only thing you do, well, there's two things actually you should do, is you estimate it on a point scale, which I'll talk to you a little bit later on, and then move it into the backlog. That's it. That's it. So when you get to the next iteration, you even will be able to choose the new work items. And I can assure you that, especially in longer running Agile projects, so I've recently finished, well, summer last year, a project that we've been doing that ran for like 2.5 years. So we had like, I don't know how many, like 70 iterations or so. And the thing is, even in iteration 68, we got new requirements. So you might say, there's some point in time where you have all the requirements. Well, you don't. They just keep coming. And then you might get into trouble. The thing is, if you have a fixed deadline, and you want to meet the deadline, or you have to meet the deadline, and you add new stuff to the backlog, you will be in trouble, right? Because you have too much work to do and you cannot finish it all. So there's two ways of going about this. First of all, you might say that if I have 6 iterations in my project, and I move along the project and I add new stuff to the backlog, that probably means that at the end of the project, I will have work items left to do. But since we prioritize over and over again every iteration, there's one thing you know about these work items at the end of the project. They are, by definition, the least important work items in the project. And I've seen it numerous times. Actually, I was coaching the very first .NET project in the Netherlands. It's quite a funny story. Maybe I should tell it. Do I have the time? Well, probably do. So I was doing Java at the time, right? And then the Microsoft Press Agency came along, because I write for a lot of magazines, and they said, okay, would you want to be at the European introduction of .NET? And I said, well, go away with your toys. I'm doing Java. This is big time, and we're good. And then they said, well, it's in Copenhagen. So I had never been in Copenhagen at that time. So I thought, okay, this might be a nice idea, and I'm going to visit Copenhagen. So when I got to Copenhagen, I got this blank CD. There were lots of presentations, as Microsoft is good at. And I had the blank CD that has handwritten on .NET 1.0 and Visual Studio, whatever version it was. I don't remember anymore, like 2001 or whatever it was. And I installed it. Took me a day to install it, by the way. And then I got back on the plane. And on the plane between Copenhagen and Amsterdam, which is about a 45 minutes flight, I wrote a first web application in .NET. Basically very simple calculator stuff, right? You know, you've all done that. And I thought, okay, this might work. Because that was the project that I was in at that point in time. That was doing 6 weeks for every form in Java, right? So, and I could do it literally in an hour in an airplane. And then the next week, a pension fund in the Netherlands phoned me up. And they said, well, we are going to do the very first .NET project in the Netherlands. And we'd like you to coach it. I said, so why? So, well, the first reason was that they were going to use the Agile approach that my company used. And the second thing was, I was one of the most experienced people in the Netherlands in .NET. So I had 6 days of experience, right? So we did the project. And the thing was, we built an online pension calculator thing. Pensions are really difficult. I don't know how that is here in the UK, but in the Netherlands, it's tough. I still don't understand anything about it. Anyway, so we built this web application, and as a result, if you calculated your pension, there was some graphs on it and some bar charts and whatever. And there was one use case that stated that we needed to be able to get a printed report out for this particular overview. And the thing that happened is that the users in that particular project continuously not did that particular use case. And the reason for that was that there was also a web page in the application that also showed the same graphs. And they said, well, well, we have the graphs already, and getting a printed report out with a logo and addresses on, etc., is just one step away. So at the end of the project, at the start of the last iteration, I think we had 10, they said, well, you know what we'll do? the web page where this is already on will just put on the logo and an address, and then people can just push the print function of your browser. So we never did the last use case, and we delivered on time. So that's one way of dealing it. The other way of dealing with it is that, well, you might say if you do not have a fixed deadline, you could say, well, if there's still useful functionality, we could add a new iteration, right? So new iterations cost money. So every new iteration you do, you have to figure out if it's worthwhile to actually do the next work items. And if you would have more business value from it, then it would cost you to build it. By the way, deciding on how much worth the next work item will be, the next feature, the next user story, the next use case, that is very tough. So what is the business value of a particular function or functionality or whatever you're building? That is tough to decide. However, it is much easier to decide how much they cost. For instance, in a long-running project I just told you about, we exactly did it. We estimated the use cases that we used in points, on a slightly different point scale than you would probably do with user stories, but I'll get to that hopefully later on. And we actually were able to, after a year, we actually exactly knew how much money it costs to implement a single point. And it was 937 euros. So that's quite an exact figure, right? So for every work item that we got onto the backlog, the client decided about, okay, is it worthwhile to do a next iteration? Because we can do, eventually they could do like 25.7 points per iteration. So doing an extra iteration, we knew exactly how much that would cost, right? So they decided every iteration again whether it was worthwhile to do the next iteration. And after 2.5 years, they stopped the project, right? We were done. There was nothing new anymore that we could do that actually had more value than what it would cost to do it. So that's another way of looking at it. So then the next question you need to ask is, if you're into a waterfall project, a lot of people will talk about requirements, right? And they will write lengthy Word documents or other word processes before that with pages and pages full of requirements, right? That is not a very sensible way of doing stuff. So in Agile projects, it goes slightly different. If you look at Scrum, the basic Scrum implementation, and again, this has some Dutch words on it. So this is the Dutch word for weeks. Looks quite similar, right? And so I guess this is the Dutch word for shippable product. So in Scrum, typical Scrum projects, but again, the Scrum guide does not tell you to do this, there is a product backlog. And the product backlog should contain the functional items that you need to build, the backlog items, your work items, your features. And in most cases, people will use stories. And they will break down the stories into tasks. And they will implement the tasks, and in the end, there will be a potentially shippable product increment. Horrible phrase, anyway. So why does it always have to be shippable at the end of the sprint? Well, because it's a mini project, right? So the thing is, in a typical Scrum project, and this is actually quite similar to what I did during the keynote, there is no such thing as getting to the backlog. There is no approach in there of getting to the backlog. There is no approach in how to get to the user stories. Most projects, and for smaller projects that will actually work, they just come up with the user stories, right? They'll just write down, well, as a certain type of user, I want to realize this so I can blah, 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 right? And that's okay in small projects, but I work for large companies, and they will want to have a slightly bit more structure in their requirements. And that is what we do. So there are also Agile approaches out there that say, well, you do not start a project at the first day you can implement stuff, but there is some preparation you need to do. For instance, you might have the requirement of having a project plan. Who of you is doing a project without a project plan? You are? Cool. I would definitely want to know what you're doing there, but I probably don't have the time to investigate now, so maybe after the talk. So, and for instance, it might be a good idea to talk about a baseline architecture. There's many Agile projects out there that actually start implementing stuff without having an architecture in place. So I'm not saying you have to build it up front and build large amounts of code and frameworks and whatever you do, but you do need to think about your architecture. You do need to think about the non-functional requirements that are out there for your project. So as I probably also discussed during the keynote, but I don't remember exactly, is that one of our projects we're currently doing has to run the global websites for a very large worldwide vendor of electronics. I'm not going to talk about which client it is, of course, and this particular website, well, it's actually 54 websites. They have like 450,000 pages in there. It's an ASP.NET MVC application, a really big one. And it has to be able to carry 4 to 5,000 concurrent users, which is quite a lot, right? And they did not set up an architecture. They just started building. And now, after a year and a half, the architecture does not meet this requirement. So they have to rethink everything they did. So it's a good idea to think about non-functional requirements, to think about a baseline architecture, to think about how to get the requirements out, although you do not want to run into the risk of doing the big upfront design. And then again, there's lots of these scrumdamentalists, as I call them, that actually say, no, you cannot do anything because everything you do is, well, basically it's waterfall if it's not in Scrum, right? And it's also the big upfront design. Well, it's not. It is not a bad idea of getting a slight overview of the requirements in your project. So basically what we usually do in projects is we start with 1 or 2 preliminary iterations where we investigate stuff like that. So on the backlog here will be stuff like, oh, create a project plan. Oh, do an estimate. Oh, get the requirements in order. Oh, do a baseline architecture. Stuff like that. And you can also move them from left to right on your board, right? It's the same idea. It's basically also work items. You can estimate how much work they are, and you can try to get them finished and get to the point that you can actually implement stuff. Still, in most of our projects, not all of the things that we decide to do here are finished by here. The project plan usually is, but we also usually have like architecture and set up your development environment. That can sometimes take a long time, especially in Java projects. Well, anyway, setting up Maven and all this stuff and getting everything deployed and Jenkins and having an application server like JBoss and stuff, well, it's more complicated than in the .NET world, actually. So these are your preliminary iterations. And I'm going to skip this one anyway, so this comes from the keynote. It's the same slide, basically. So if you look at XP, it doesn't do that. XP basically says there is a customer who writes down the user stories on index cards, and then we can start. Where they come from and how they are hooked into your organization's strategy or your business goals or whatever you might have is very unclear. There is no path in there for doing that. And the same goes for Scrum, by the way. So, well, I already showed this. This is the official picture, I guess. Here's the potentially shippable product increment. And here's your product backlog, usually in stories, but it doesn't have to be. Breaking it down into smaller stuff and trying to get that out, right? And then there's other Agile approaches like DSDM, which comes from the UK anyway. And they have something like a feasibility study and a business study. These are 2 short iterations where you can actually do stuff like creating what's called in DSDM the prioritized requirements list. So it's stuff like that that you can do. And the same goes for FDD. This is the basic picture for feature-driven development, short FDD. They build up a features list. And the same goes for the Agile approach we usually use, which is originally based on DSDM but grew in a totally different direction, where we realize stuff and at the end of our release, so this is a release basically, we finalize stuff, we put a ribbon around it and deploy it, and then we go into the next release. Doesn't always have to be full, right? They can be 2 or 6 or 1 or whatever you do. But we do also have these preliminary iterations called propose and scope. And during this first iteration, we usually get out the proposal. And whether that's inside an organization or we make official proposals to a client, this is basically the steps we take. In the global Agile approach we're going to have at Capgemini, these 2 will probably be combined, and it's probably going to be called prepare or something. But it's basically the same idea. Prepare for getting ready to realize your software, right? So then if you look at user stories, and I'm only going to touch this briefly. Personally, I like user stories for smaller projects, but I don't like user stories for big projects and big organizations. They're just not enough, right? So this is the basic format. As a type of user, I want some goals so that for some reason. And basically, that's it. It's the single sentence that is going to describe your requirements. And in many projects, this is not enough. So I talked to a project team about, well, maybe a year and a half, maybe even 2 years ago. And they had built all the software that they needed. And they had written down all their requirements on user stories on index cards. And then the application needed to move to the application management department. And the application management department said, we are not going to maintain your software. And they said, why? The software's fine, it's working, and everything's okay. And they said, well, there's no documentation. We cannot maintain it based on a stack of index cards. And they had like 1,000. They were building on a product and a huge stack of these index cards. And they just couldn't get it into application management. So that's not a good idea, right? So basically, a user story looks like this. As a new customer, I want to register on the site so I can buy a product, right? And you can add some stuff to it. But there's a number of issues with these user stories. I'm not sure I have that on the slide. No. Well, first of all, it's a very limited way of doing things, right? Having a single sentence describe your requirements is in most projects just not enough. If you have a very complex systems landscape with a service-oriented architecture or a microservices architecture or whatever you might do, this is just not enough because you cannot link it to, for instance, your domain models, or you cannot link it to everything that's layers above that. And we decided years ago that we in bigger projects, we would do things slightly different. So we came up with something that is called smart use cases. So you might say, use cases, that's waterfall. Well, no, it isn't. It's a requirements technique. It does not have anything to do with what type of project you're doing. Or people might say, oh, this is a rational unified project thing, well, processing. Well, it's not. It's just a requirements technique. But the thing with use cases is that they have slightly more ceremony added to it than user stories, right? Have you ever written use cases? Okay, good. So I'm going to explain a bit about how to write those. I'm going to show to you how to do that in Enterprise Architect, which is a modeling tool. And I'm even going to generate code for them. So I'm trying to explain to you what this does. So this is an interesting picture. When I first saw this one, I think it was in 1995 or 96 or whatever, this comes from a book by a guy called Alistair Cockburn, spelled C-O-C-K, Burn, which for obvious reasons you do not pronounce like that. And he says, well, there's different layers of granularity in doing this stuff. And he says, well, basically, if you look at stuff like user stories, well, he doesn't talk about user stories, but that's the interpretation I gave to it. If you talk about user stories or features or use cases, they usually reside at what is called the C level or the user goal level. Why? Well, basically because they identify a single user goal for a single group. And the thing is with that is, usually these things, especially if you do use cases, they still can be really big or really small and not that complex. For instance, I had a project where one of the use cases was log in. Well, you can do that. And this was again at a pension fund. And one of the other ones was do the quarterly billing. And out came like 1.3 million invoices. It's not the same thing, but basically they are both at the user goal level because they satisfy a single user goal, right? So the thing is, you can look at two directions. You can go up and say, so what's up? What is in the level up from the user goal level? Well, it's basically, you can look at, maybe you are implementing business processes, right? So large organizations usually do it. They implement a new business process. And if you do that, you should be able to identify those business processes, and I'll show you some examples later on, at this particular level. And they should adhere to, let's say, your business strategy or whatever you might do, which is on the cloud level, right? So you can actually break it down, which seems also to be a hard phrase to use in Agile, but you can break it down from what's coming from the business, literally from the business, into stuff that you can actually build. Well, the trouble is, if you do these user goal level stuff, like user stories should be at this level, like use cases are usually at this level, the thing is they can be too big and too complicated to implement in Agile projects. Because in an Agile project, you would want to finish your work items within an iteration. So if you have a 2-week iteration, and you have a use case like do the quarterly billing, which took us like 1.5 years to build, by the way, that is not a suitable unit of work for your sprint, right? So you have to break it down again. And what we found out, coincidentally, because I was reading a book about use cases. Later on I've written one, but it's in Dutch, so you won't be able to read it unless you can read Dutch. I was interpreting it slightly wrong, I guess. So that must have been like in 1998, and I was saying, okay, we can break this down and we can use the use case diagram, which is a very easy technique to do, to break down these user level use cases into sub-function level use cases. So if you do that, and you'd probably be able to do the same with user stories. I'm still looking for a project to experiment with that. You can break them down into smaller use cases. They still have the same format, but they're much smaller. And the thing is, if you do that, and if you use the guidelines to doing that more or less correctly, because there is no right or wrong in that, they all become smaller and also on the same level of granularity. And that allowed us to use those in Agile projects. So I'm going to show you through the whole approach now. So this is the same levels as in Alistair's picture, but then in a vertical way. So usually you look at what is the scope of my project. And you can look at that from a perspective saying, okay, if the A here is my project, what are we going to do within this project? What are the larger parts of this project? What are maybe the large components or the groups of processes that I might be wanting to implement, right? So if you can identify them, you can just do it. By the way, you can use any modeling technique you might use. You can do this on a flip chart, on a whiteboard, in PowerPoint, in a modeling tool, whatever you might do. So outcome, let's say groups of processes. So I'll show you an example in a real model really quickly. And then you can drill down onto the kite level. So if you do it from a business process perspective, there's probably two types of processes that you might be looking at. Like chronological processes, so I'm going to book a trip, and I need to book a hotel, I need to book some flights, and I need to book a taxi and a car, and whatever you might do. And that needs approval, etc., etc. That's a chronological process, right? And on the other hand, you might have, let's say, groups of individual smaller processes that just belong together. So for instance, you might have everything that has to do with authorization, like I have to do login, logout, change password, reset password, manage groups and roles and users and stuff, manage permissions. So you could put it again in this format, right? And the thing is, what we discovered, if we did that, and actually the project that we discovered it in was this really big and ugly Java project that we did at the end of the 90s, because it had a huge business process that they wanted to implement. And it consisted of 25 steps. And any one of those 25 steps, we could model out at one level deeper. So we created a model to do that. And that's actually where this mapping comes from. So what you could say is, every one of these little rectangles, you could identify that as something which in business process modeling is called an elementary business process. And they are easy to recognize, because there is a very simple guideline for looking at this. It's called ODOPOP. Not sure if you ever heard of this acronym. You haven't? Well, you should. It stands for one time, one place, one person. So if a particular process is executed at one point in time by one role at one location, then you probably have an ODOPOP process or an elementary business process. And that is a very good point in time to step over to implementing stuff. So what we did is we said, well, every one of these elementary business processes, we are going to model that out into a use case diagram. First of all, starting with the user goal level use case, the D, which is the same as this one. So we have created now traceability from the goals of my project into use cases that we can actually build. Well, this one you can build, but it takes a long time because they can be really complex. So we added the next level. So we said every one of these use cases, every one of these elementary business processes modeled out in a use case, we're going to do a little bit more of these ovals. Every oval is a use case, by the way, if you've never seen a use case diagram. I'm going to show you real ones later on. And when we did this, we found out that all these little ovals together, which we over time started calling smart use cases, is a very good unit of work in an Agile project. And then we started on automating everything in the process. So this is an example from a very ugly project. Again, it's in Dutch. And every one of these colors is actually a project. So these are like 6 projects in one chart. This is the stuff that the business comes up with, right? They're going to show you, oh yeah, this is what I want to do. And they sort of like meet over it and they draw more pictures and rectangles in it and whatever they do. And this has no explicit meaning because it's very hard to tell what the meaning is of the fact that this is a rectangle and this one is a dashed oval. Nobody knows what it is, right? But it is the business way of looking at stuff. They look at stuff differently than we do, right? So the thing, what we did is, with this particular project, by the way, I think the purple one was the first one we did in this particular program, we model it out. So we created a diagram like this. This is just a hierarchical diagram at the high level. They actually, at this client, they actually said, well, this is at cloud level and this is at kite level. So if you drill down on one of these rectangles, like I'm going to drill down on this one, it actually was clear that this one was a process, right? So this is modeled in a way you model processes. So you can do that with flowcharts, or with BPMN, or with an activity diagram, or maybe with a workflow diagram if you use Workflow Foundation, for instance, or whatever you might do. So any one of these steps is actually an elementary business process. They're still in Dutch, but you won't be able to read it anyway, even if it was in English. So for any one of these steps, we create a use case diagram, which is probably on the next slide. Oh, it used to be. I'll show that later on. This is actually the diagram, but it's only part of it, right? So I guess I moved it into the wrong template for this one. So this one is actually the same as this one. And we added a bunch of these use cases. There are actually 5 of them in this particular diagram, which allowed us to build them individually. And I'll show you some of the tactics of how we built this stuff. So here's the difference, right? So here's a typical use case. This actually comes from the website, which is called smartusecase.com, www.smartusecase.com, of course. So this is a single use case at user goal level. It's called register call. This actually comes from a call center application. And if you start looking at this one, you might say, okay, if I register a call, so somebody phones that their washing machine broke down, right? They're going to say like, oh yeah, my washing machine. Okay, wait. Who are you? So you identify the client first, right? And if he's not in the system, you're going to add him to the system. And then you start looking for the product that has actually broken down. And after that, you can say, okay, you know what? I'm going to define a first activity like a mechanic comes along, or the mechanic will call you back, or whatever you might do. Or maybe you tell him just to go out because there's no guarantee on the machine anymore, and et cetera, et cetera. So you could write that down in a very thick document, right? If you would do the single use case, that will take you probably around 60 pages. It will have multiple forms in there, lots of a very big basic flow, and lots of alternative flows, et cetera, et cetera. So we start breaking this thing down into smaller use cases. So this is the same thing as this one, except that we pulled out a lot of these little ovals. Like here's an oval that says, okay, I'm going to search for the customer. If he's not there, this actually should be a registered customer. Now it's managed customer. So I'm going to add him. I'm going to find if there's has been a call before on this particular product. And if not, we're going to find a new project and we're going to define a first activity and we're done, right? So if you do it like this, parts of the complexity of this particular piece of functionality goes into the diagram instead of into a Word document. And for us, that's a big benefit. So we took it a lot of steps further. So the benefits of doing this is well, there's multiple, right? For instance, it's much more visual. So we do these modeling sessions with clients. And my current project, the product owner, it's an insurance company, the product owner for this particular project is the CEO of the company. And it's a well-known, well-respected insurance company in the Netherlands. He sits in on these modeling workshops. He sits in with us to create these smart use case diagrams. And he understands that. And he even starts talking in our vocabulary, so to say. So that actually works. So it's much more visual. And also, it's a unified look at use cases because they're all having more or less the same size. The benefit of that is that you can estimate them at a single linear scale. So estimation becomes, well, fairly easy to do. Also, it's a good unit of work in Agile projects. And an important thing is, something you do not have with user stories, is that you can identify reuse. For instance, this little oval here says search customer. If you are building a call center application or a call center system, whatever you might call it, well, a thing like search for a customer will appear in multiple diagrams, right? And you only build it once and you reuse it all over again. So you identify functional reuse early on in the project. And again, it's more traceable. It comes from the business goals down to the functionality you're building. And it is also much better testable. I'm going to show you that. So I'm not sure how far I am with my time. Oh, I spent too much time already. Okay, so we're going to move on a bit quicker. So these are basically our guidelines for getting these use cases out from the bigger use case. And they go at any level, right? It's like if you see from a piece of functionality inside of your use case that you might want to reuse this, you can just pull it out, right? Or if we also say, do not model more than one form per use case. So every form you have in the interaction of this big use case, just pull it out as a separate use case. And the same goes for things like web parts and calculations and interaction with other systems, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a bunch of guidelines that you can actually use to pull those things out. Oh, here's the diagram I was going to show. And then you get these diagrams. I'll show you some other examples, like this one. This is a bigger one. This is coming from a system that managing the contact. So it was partly a CRM system that we were building for a client. These are all the little use cases that we have in this particular diagram. So it came out of, it actually grew over time. This is one that we still, at the end of the projects, were adding new stuff to it. And this is basically a single form with a lot of tab pages on it. I don't like the UI metaphor, but they wanted it like that. And each one of these orange ovals is actually a view on that particular web form. And the yellow ones are all other pieces of functionality that we could start from that particular use case. So here's another one. This is an even more complex one. This one comes from the Dutch Railways. They use the technology as well. This one is actually their web front end. This is all middleware stuff. And this is all aggregational service stuff and whatever. And these are all back-end systems. For instance, the light yellow one is an SAP system. This one is a back-end system built in .NET. We didn't do that 10 years ago, but they did it. And so there's lots of systems that collaborate in this particular diagram, right? So, and there you can see that it's actually reused. This comes from Enterprise Architect, a modeling tool, a very good and not that expensive modeling tool. And you can easily see that the use case select contact is used in a whole bunch of these diagrams. So it's traceable and you can have reuse by doing this, right? So that's a good thing. So when we started doing this, we soon arrived at a situation that we said, well, okay, we recognize that there's certain things that you can do in use cases that are the same again and again and again. For instance, if I would have a use case to, let's say, to register for something, registering for, I don't know what, a subscription or whatever, it's still the same thing, right? It pops up a form, you fill in the data, it checks the data, you submit, blah, 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 done. That's a specific piece of functionality that we use to refer to as a register. You can also say we have a manage for just maintaining a single instance of a particular domain object, or you have things like search or select or multi-select or list detail or whatever you might have, and use case types, as we call them, that do, for instance, services. So there's, for any type of service, we identified a type of use case. So we ended up with a whole list of standard types of use cases. Now, that allowed us to move a bit further down the road, because if we could identify standard types of use cases, that means a lot of things. That means we can test them more easily, because it's the same pattern, actually. Basically, they're patterns, right? Functional patterns. And also, we added an estimation scale to it that allowed us to estimate the use cases based on a point scale, based on these standard types. So now when we model stuff, we estimate on the fly. So as soon as we put out a little oval on the diagram, it's automatically estimated. Well, you do that with the team that you're modeling with anyway. So that's the stuff, how we do it. So getting to these estimates, what we'll do is we've put up a very simple scale, which is different scale than if you do user story points, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the scale we started using like 10, 12 years ago. Basically ranging from very easy stuff to the difficult stuff. And we added these two slightly bit later to allow us to say, okay, this is stuff that we cannot grasp yet. We'll find it out later on in the project, but for now we just name it a 10, knowingly that we have to figure this out later on in the project, right? So that allows us to give a very, very easy estimate on doing this stuff. So you put a number on each one of these little ovals, like this. This is the easy thing to do if you do PowerPoint, right? Or you do it while modeling, for instance. So, let me show you this in the real diagram, because I have this diagram on my laptop. So, let's see if I can switch from PowerPoint. So I'm going to open up Enterprise Architect, which is the modeling tool I just told you about. If my laptop will do that. Can you see that? Okay, good. So one of these is actually the particular diagram. So I'm going to show you the whole path through this. I'm actually going to start at the top. So this is the first diagram we did, right? This is coming from a real project. This is The project was called Titan, as you can see on the left. And this is the very first level in the approach with going from cloud level into deeper and deeper. So if we double click on this one, we get a slightly different diagram. Basically, it's the same type of diagram. It just splits it up even further. And if you go down one level deeper, we come up with the use case diagram. So this is the big diagram that I've actually shown you. So what we've done for Enterprise Architect, I don't know if you're familiar with UML tooling. Who uses UML tools? That's too few, I would say. Because you can actually, I'm not saying you have to do UML for everything. So if you followed Simon's workshop on Monday, he'd say, well, we do not do UML for architecture. And I totally agree. I'm not going to model my architecture in UML, but I am going to model my use cases in a UML tool, basically because it has a repository, right? The same reason you put your code into a repository, because you want to be able to find it back and reuse it and drag it onto your diagrams, etc. So if you look at a diagram like this, so what we did with the whole list of these standard types, we put up a toolbox for it. And you can do that with most UML tools. You can just write something which is called a UML profile, import it in the tool, and it's not that hard to do. It's basically an XML file. And if you want, I can give you mine. I have it on my laptop, but it's probably not downloadable from the website in the current status. So we can just say, okay, I'm going to need a new manage use case. I'm just going to drop it onto the diagram. It says, okay, after a while, what's the name of this? I don't know what. Manage. I can't even type today. Manage user, for instance. So bang, there I have it. And what you can see now is that, I'm trying to zoom in a bit. Does that work? Yeah. That we already have this number up. This is not standard use case stuff. We added that with a slide script, which you can also download. I was hoping to have it here, but I was improvising a little bit. Oh, I need to click on one, right? So we did the scale in here, so we can actually estimate while modeling. And we actually do that. And the good thing about it is, if you model with clients and you estimate with the clients, there is no doubt about the result, right? People are going to say, clients are going to say, oh yeah, we estimated this thing at 370 points. Must be good, because we estimated with you. And that's a very interesting approach to doing that. So this is basically how you can model that stuff. And I'm coming back to this tool later on. Because once we started doing that, we thought, you know what? We also need to be able to get this stuff out again, out of the model. So what we basically did is, what we basically did is we wrote a code generator. Well, have to bring this one along. Because we're developers, right? And we love to write tools that help us out to do things more quickly. And what you can do with a UML tool is, if you have a UML model, part of the specification says you can export it. If you do that, you will get a very big XML file called an XMI. And the thing is, if you build a tool, you can actually read that in again, right? So the code generator we built, Tobago, actually reads the UML model, and it has a part of the UML meta model inside. So we can actually get the whole model in the tool and do stuff with it. I'm going to show you a little bit about that. And if I have the time, I can actually show you how the thing works, because it's a very straightforward thing. So I'm not saying you have to use Tobago as a code generator. You can, because you can just download it, but it's just a way of doing stuff. So I'm not going to show you now how to export the diagram of the model, because I'm going to do that later on. So this is Tobago. I'm not sure if you can all see this. So what Tobago does, it reads the UML model, and it hooks that up with a set of templates. Templates are just basic text files, and I can show you that when we're going to talk about code generation. So basically what I now want to do is pick the whole model, and there's a very simple template that allows me to generate an estimate for this. I can probably do this. Let me do it like this. You're not going to see what happens now, but it has now generated this stuff. We have originally had what's it called? Whatever. The icon that shows you it's in progress, but it goes so fast that it doesn't show. But I'm going to pick up the file now, if I can find it. It's somewhere in my projects directory, so it should be in here, in the model directory, wherever it is. Okay. So let's see if I just generated one. Just click this open. It's a good thing I have my mouse with me. Oh, crap. Stupid Windows. Right, what's the date? So it's this one, right? I just generated this one. So if I open this up, we should probably clean it up, because it will show a message now. And it just says, okay, here's a whole bunch of use cases that you have in the model. So we just generated this Excel spreadsheet saying, okay, the total number of use case points now is 380. That's an easy way of doing things, right? So we use the code generator for just about anything we can do. And we're going to do much more fun with it later on. So, just to continue, so what's the next step? So once you identify the model, this is basically where we get out of these preliminary iterations. So here's the model, here's the estimate. And if you know how many points you can do per iteration, or how much a point will cost given your specific team setup and organization setup and the culture and whatever you might have, you can start building. And you can do a very decent estimate of the size of your project. So once we've done that, we start implementing them. So we move into the actual part of the project that is building stuff, right? So what we have identified is that implementing use cases takes a number of steps to do that, right? So differently than if you would do user stories and split them up into tasks, for quite a few projects that I've seen, they split it up like, okay, here's the functionality, the backlog item, and I need to split it up. You know what? I have to build it, I have to test it, I have to write the unit test, I have to do some analysis on it, I have to create the services, etc., etc. So we skip doing these because we said, well, basically every use case, but you probably could do this with user stories as well, has a life cycle. The life cycle is a bit like, okay, first we start off with identifying what we need to know about this use case. We usually do this during a stand-up meeting. It's very brief, like in 1 minute, okay, we're going to touch now on this particular use case. What do we need to know about this use case to get it going? And the next step is we do what we call a use case design session. So the developer and the tester and the business analyst and the product owner and whoever you might have in your project sit together in a workshop and write down the use case. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a second using Enterprise Architect, because Enterprise Architect does a little bit of automation for us, especially for testers. Well, none of you is a tester, right? Because this is not a testing conference, but anyway, I'm going to show you that anyway. And then the tester steps out and is going to do the test design. That's a lot of work. I'll show you some pictures of that. And the developer starts building the use case. And what we did is we created our software architecture in a way that we could actually build the use cases in code. So that's what we do. And then we test it, and then sometimes it goes into rework, so it can go back into the cycle, or it goes to acceptance, and then the product owner comes in and says, okay, this is okay, I'm going to run my acceptance test, and this is okay in the next use case, right? So this is a life cycle. The good thing about having such a small life cycle, and you can actually do this with small use cases, well, depending on the technology you use, but you should be able to do this in about a day. Right? So we do a number of these use cases per sprint. So if we do that, then people start writing use cases. Traditionally, people would do this in Word documents. And the format for a use case, I'll show you in a few slides, is basically always the same. But I'll be delving into that a little bit later on. And then with that description of the use case, the tester goes out, creates maybe an activity diagram or a flow chart. This is what a lot of testers actually do. And create this and work on all the scenarios that you might get running through this particular use case. So basically, this is a scenario. This is usually the base scenario. And this one is a scenario, but also this one is a scenario, or this one, or this one, or this one. So there's lots of scenarios. Even from such a simple diagram as this one, there are lots of scenarios that testers need to test. Because they test all the scenarios, right? Not just like we do, the developers. We think, okay, if we get here, we're happy, right? It works. We're optimists, they're pessimists, right? It's a totally different ballgame, testing. So, but I love to have a tester in my project. Testers are a bit like this, right? This is a picture I took from one of my colleagues. He actually has a set of these very thin markers in different colors to be able to do this. He actually draws the activity diagrams in his little book. And then he writes down all the possible scenarios of running through this thing. Well, this is a lot of work, actually. And after having done that, what they usually do is this. They create humongous spreadsheets with test data in it. And they test everything. And this is a lot of work. So what we said is, hopefully we can automate this stuff a little bit. And I'm going to show you that you can actually do that. Is that this one? Oh, no, that's about the backlog. Oh, yeah, I'm going to do one very, very tiny demo, what you can also do with your exported UML model. Because we created a tool called www.speedbird9.com. It's basically an online Kanban board. So I'm not going to advertise it because we don't make money out of it. It just costs us money, by the way. But we use this to track our projects. Well, let me show you just what happens, right? If I still have an internet connection up. So the exported file that I have, which is an XML file, with all the use cases in it and everything that is in the model, we can not only import it into the code generator, but we also import it into our, oh, this is my email. Not really interesting stuff though, but so this is actually our test site. So we're working on some more responsiveness for the website. I'm probably already logged out. See if he automatically logs me in again. So this is not the official one. The official one is just speedbird9.com. So if I go to my project, I'm going to take one of my test projects for this. What I can do is I can create my own dashboard, of course. It takes a while now because this server is not really that fast. Don't know what it's doing anyway now, but hopefully it pops up again. Oh, there it goes. So this is empty. This one has only 3 stages, but you can add new stages to it and define your own stages, etc., etc. So we can just say, okay, with all these use cases, we can just import them into the tool. And we try automating as much as possible, right, in our projects. So I'm just going to select the export. Oh, my laptop is getting really, really slow. That's really promising. I have to open up Visual Studio in a second. And I upload them. And it just gets all the use cases from the file as soon as it uploads. And it's going to create a list, and I can just import them, and it'll show up on the dashboard. That's, for us, if we do that, is a very quick start. So here they are. I'm not going to press the import items button, but this is a very quick start of getting our dashboard up and running to move into the realize iteration thread. So not going to advertise this. It's a free dashboard, and it will remain free. Just because we love building it. It's my team and I who built this, and we just love working on it, and we probably do new stuff on it every week. And well, anyway, so then we move into the way Enterprise Architect can help you out doing automation for a lot of this stuff that you otherwise, as a tester, have to do manually, right? So, yep, that's yeah, okay. This is what a dashboard looks like if it's filled in, if there's work items on it, blah 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 blah. Okay, so. Writing down a use case is very similar for every use case, no matter whether it's a user-goal level use case or whether it's a sub-function level use case. Oh, I left the marker there. Horrible. So if you have a use case, there's a few elements that you need to describe about a use case. So use cases have preconditions. So those are the conditions that you need to meet to be allowed to run the use case, right? And the same thing goes, it has post conditions on the other side. So this is what the use case does for you, right? So if I have a use case called search customer, my post condition will probably be, I will have a domain object of type customer. Or maybe you can cancel it halfway or whatever you might do. So it probably has a number of these post conditions. And then it has a basic flow. So the basic flow is basically a number of steps that you execute basically to get to what we call the positive post condition. So this is where I want to end. And on every one of these steps, you might going to say, well, there's an alternative to do this. So usually the format for writing down use cases is that there's no ifs in here. You probably like that. There's no ifs in here. And so the ifs are actually written down in something else. It's called an alternative flow. So with an alternative flow, if this is my basic flow, you write down where it starts, from which step. So usually these are numbered. Oh, I have 2, 3, 4, 5. So it starts at step 3, and it does some stuff, usually numbered like 3.1, 3.2, etc., etc., and it might go back to your original scenario. What it could also do is it could end. So usually that ends in a negative post condition. It could also be that there's another alternative flow that starts from 3.2, etc., etc., and then have some more steps. So if you do this at the user goal level, it's not an exception that these documents writing down these use cases can be really big. We had one in a project. I wasn't in the project, by the way, but it's a good example. That had 65 pages for one single use case at user goal level. It had a basic flow of 12 pages in the Word document. It had over 100 alternative flows. So for a tester, that is impossible to test. And even for developers, it was really hard to build. This single use case was called change address. That is plain horrible, right? But the thing is, if you do this with these smart use cases, which are really, really small, you can actually, it's actually very limited. So the basic flow is usually like 10 to 20 steps, and there's usually 1 to 5 of these alternative flows. That's basically it. So that's a very good unit to build and to test. And the funny thing is, where did I leave the clicker? Oh, it's here. And the funny thing is, testers love this too. So I'm going to show you what Enterprise Architect can do for you in this particular case. So I have the slides in the deck just to make sure that you can actually see it, but I am going to do a live demo. So, bang, there we go again. I'm going into Enterprise Architect again. I'm going to pick one of these particular use cases that I just showed you on the big diagram. There it is. Takes some time. What can I close? Excel. I can close down Excel, right? This is the only use of Excel I do. Where's my model? There. Now PowerPoint is probably blocking it. My browser. No. Tobago is still there. So here's my diagram. And what you can see here, I'm going to take this particular use case called Manage Relationship, which is a very hard thing to do anyway, even if you model it out. I'm going to show you the property. So this is the property box for this particular use case. So what's in there? There's a thing in there that is called scenarios. So no, I cannot enlarge it here, but I could do it there. So what you see here is a number of steps, right? And with every one of these steps, it's either the system that does it or it's one of the actors that does it, right? By the way, on my blog, there's two good posts about how to write down these scenarios in the tool of Enterprise Architect. Or if you're interested in this, I recommend that as a reading. And it has a number of these alternative flows, right? So on step 5, it says actor clicks select other contact. But he could also say, I'm going to switch the contacts that are now on the page. So it's actually bringing together 2 contacts. And he could also say, okay, there's another one at step 10. What is in step 10? I don't know. Actor clicks save. And after that, the system starts validating stuff and saves it, etc., etc. So there's a number of alternative flows here that says, well, the actor might also cancel the interaction, go out of the use case, etc., etc. It's actually pretty straightforward stuff, to be honest. So the nice thing that Enterprise Architect allows you to do is if you have specified it in this way, in this structured way, and the good thing about it is if a new step is in between the other steps, then it will move down all the other steps and the numbering, stuff that you don't have if you do this in a Word document, right? So what it can do for you, it can actually generate the activity diagram that I've shown you that our tester draws by hand. He was very surprised when I first showed him this. Take some time. Oh, there it is, right. So there you have. This is actually the activity diagram that models out the different scenarios in this particular use case. Testers love this. And I'm going to show you it even a step further, because the next step would be that he or she has to identify all the scenarios through the use case to get to one of the post conditions. And they have to test each and every one of them. So what Enterprise Architect also can do, it can take it up a step further. And I'm going to show you that too. So I'm going to press the F8 button. Takes a while. Takes longer than I expect. I have to have a new travel laptop. So here's my use case, manage contact. And this is a dialog for generating documentation for the use case. So what it will do is it will generate the text I've put in, the scenarios that I have, but also it will also identify the different test scenarios that are out there. And that's a very interesting thing. So we created a simple template for doing that. I'm just going to generate it now. Do I really have only 10 minutes left? Is there a coffee break after this one? Oh, good. Because I want to show you some code generation as well. Oh, crap, I chose the wrong scope. Anyway, this is not going good, right? Oh, crap, I always have that. Yeah, document created, but it's too big. It's not the one I wanted. Probably didn't, I selected the whole diagram instead of the single use case. I'm going to do it again, right? We have time enough. Only 10 minutes. Am I doing my presentation? I usually end on time. You've seen it, right? I can end on time in presentations. Not always. So now it should be done much quicker. Puff. There it is. Right. Let's view it. So here's the document it just generated. It has my general description in it, pre and post conditions, my basic path, all my alternative flows. It even shows up the diagrams that belong to this use case, although you can probably do something with it here. And here's all the test scenarios. So this saves our tester a whole bunch of work. So that's interesting, right? So let's move on to the last part. So after the tester has done this and he starts writing down all these test cases and all the individual test data that he needs, we are going to do the next step, and that is building zones. So these are the same things, but then in slides, so you can look at it at home and in the train and blah, 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 blah. Here's another document, and here's the diagram sideways. But anyway, so here's the scenarios. Okay, so the next question is, can we take it one step further? One step further would be if we could also generate code from this stuff. And you might think, okay, code generation, wasn't that the thing that if we have a data model, we can generate, let's say, domain objects or whatever you do, or no, you can take code generation way further than this. We generate, well, I'm not going to say we generate everything, because that's impossible, right? That's utopic. You don't do that. You have to write code. I want to write code, so I made it sure that we have to write code, but you cannot put everything in a model. There is stuff that you can build much faster than you can put in a model. But the good thing is, if you do stuff like code generation, it keeps away the repetitive work. If I have a domain model with 200 domain objects in it, which I have on my current client, I don't want to have to type them all again into either C# or Java, right? It would be much easier if you could generate that stuff out. So that's just one thing you can do. But if you are able to standardize the use cases already, you might say, why can I not generate code for use cases as well? So we started doing that, like, I don't know what, 7, 8 years ago. So if you start doing code generation, the thing is, you can do code generation the best if you can standardize a lot of things. So standardization sounds boring maybe, but it's just standardizing on the way your architecture looks like. So if you have an architecture in place, you can start doing code generation. So my Java project, where we have just done the first iteration, before I left for London, I showed Tobago, the code generator, to the guys in my team. They'd never seen it before. So I told them, okay, this is the way you can do templates, and if you have existing code, it's really easy to create a template. And they now created templates. Instead of creating a framework, what they usually do, the Java developers, they now are creating templates, right, to generate code. That is good. So the way it works is that we set up our software architecture, and I can show you that in code as well, with these layers. So we have, of course, a presentation layer. We have a domain layer, of course, with all the patterns in there. I've talked about this yesterday a little bit. We have a data services layer that helps us get out of the application into the databases or into messaging brokers or whatever you might have on the backside. So this is basically it. But the interesting thing is, we have a layer for use cases. And we actually do not navigate from page to page if it's a web application, or from activity to activity if it's an Android application, or from screen to screen if it's a Windows desktop application. We navigate between the use cases. So the actual code in the application is actually a direct implementation of the use case model. And that's not something everybody does. It's a nice way of working. And then we use Tobago to do that. And the thing how Tobago works is you can create templates for it. Really easy, actually. It's basically text. And I can open up some of the templates in a sec. And what it will do is, if it imports the UML model, and I apply a template to an element from the model, it will replace those tags by the name of the element in the model, or in this case, for the whole model. And it has a tiny DSL to be able to look through the attributes of classes or use cases or whatever you might have and get code out that in subtemplates, which looks like this. For instance, this is a subtemplate for generating a single property from a domain object, right? It has a getter and a setter, and it has some annotations to it or attributes, so some basic stuff like that. And you can create your own templates for your project, for your own architecture, that is, by the way. So I'm going to show you that in a second. So basically, this is how it works. So we create the use cases, we create a domain model. We always do. I love domain-driven design. Been doing that for like years and years and teaching it and whatever. And then we drag it into the code generator. Oh, right. We first set up our software architecture, which is basically similar for all our projects. Then we drag it into the code generator. And the last step will be, okay, finish it off, right? So if you do code generation in each of these layers, there's always stuff that you can easier build than generate, right? Like the way the fields on your pages are placed, or where the buttons are, or some business logic, business rules, etc., etc. Those are much easier to implement than to generate. But we can actually do this. And out comes things like this. For instance, a large number of the standard use case types have a form associated with it. So this is coming from a web application. This is typically the screen you would get from a search use case. So it has some elements you can search on. You click on search and out comes a list. And if I click on one, I've selected in this case a contact. That's the end of this particular use case. So it passes back to the use case it's calling from, and that use case can use that to execute its own functionality, just like is written down in the scenarios in the use case. Or you can do it for Windows 8 or what. You can create your own template, so you can do just about anything. So this is the last demo I'll do. Hopefully I'm still on time. Am I? Well, just about. I only have 5 minutes to build an application. Not the whole application, but yeah, I am going to try and do some stuff. So bear with me. Just to be sure, I'm going to show you the last slides, because then I can close PowerPoint, which is always a good thing. So this is the slide, in retrospective, right? There is nothing here. Oh, there it is, right? So can you do modeling in Agile projects? Yes. Does it help? Yes. If your projects are big enough, it might be better to do some modeling instead of doing user stories. It keeps your traceability up, and it also allows you to do lots of other nice stuff, like generate code and generate test data and whatever you do. So yes, you can do it. It takes some time to get used to, but it actually can be really useful. So this is really the last slide, and I'm going to close down PowerPoint. This is my personal website, www.hoogendoorn.com. It has a lot of stuff around this, also around modeling domain models, etc., etc. Here again is Speedbird9, and this is my Twitter hashtag. So now I'm closing PowerPoint. You can find it, the thing online. So I have 2 models open now. I'm going to use the other one. Hopefully I don't close the good one. Oh, there it is. So I have an empty diagram. What I will do now is I'm going to create a use case, a single use case of type, what we call list detail. And if I show you the code, I can show you what it does. So here's my use case. I'm going to name it manage country. Really simple stuff. So what I'll do now, because I already have my domain model in place in this particular application, I'm going to look at the properties of this one. I always forget which one it is. This one. Yep. So I'm going to add a property called country. And it is of type country. Country is one of my domain objects, right? So there it is. I'm going to select it. And what I'll do now, I'm going to set up the stereotype here. Because the code generator reads the stereotypes and allows you to generate code for a specific stereotype. So I'm now going to generate this thing in a list detail situation. So if you don't understand it, bear with me. It will become clear in just about 2 minutes or something. So this is it. I have to draw this particular line so you can see that the actor is actually doing the use case. So this is the modeling I do. This is all because the manage type use case, or the list detail type use case in this case, is fairly straightforward. So what I'll do now is I'll export the model. I'm going to switch off some stuff here just to save time. Add the tag values, do the export. So this is creating the UML export file, right? It's a big XML file. I'm not going to show you that because it's plain ugly. It's very hard to read it anyway. It takes a while because it's a fairly big model. By the way, the new version of the code generator, Tobago, if you download it now, it will allow you to interact with the model in 3 different ways, depending on the type of model you have. Usually, these models sit in a repository. That can be, with this tool, it can either be something they call an EAP, which is basically an MS Access file, MS Access database, or it can be in a SQL Server or MySQL database, or you can export it in the XMI. And the new version of Tobago, which you can just download, can handle all 3 of them, right? So I now have an exported file. What I'll do now is open up the code generator. Since I already had it open, it says, well, you have modified your XMI file. You want me to reload it? So yeah, sure, do that. So it's now reading in this thing. Where is it? There it is, right. So it has now read the UML file. I'm going to show you a tiny bit about what this pattern looks like. So I'm going to pick up the domain object pattern. I'm going to open up the folder where it is. So this is basically a small file describing what the pattern is. And this is the actual pattern for the domain object. So there it is. As you can see, there's just tags in here that get replaced if you hook on the domain object to this template, and it will just generate the code. I'll show you. So where's Tobago? There it is. So if I have on my Generate tab a domain object, for instance country, I could use the same template because it hooks it up through the stereotypes. I'm going to show you what's the result of this. So just press the button, it will generate this, right? It has replaced all the tags in here and all the properties and stuff that we do, etc., within the way we build stuff. And that can be totally different for your projects, right? So, but what we'll do now is I'm going to pick up the manage country use case. Just look for it. It should be there. So this is the one I just created. And I'm going to generate the web page for it using the code, the generic code behind template and the generic form, and the use case itself, which we call a task. It's a horrible name for it, but when we started, yeah, well, we should have called it use case, of course. And I'm going to just generate this stuff. Well, as you can see, it doesn't seem to do anything. But if I go back to Visual Studio will say, hey, you changed this thing. Do you want to reload it? Yes, please, do. So here's the web page. It has just generated. And it fits within the way we have done the web page in this particular project. And I know I have to change something because my country class does not have a description. But it does have, I think it has a capital. Let me check. Oh, yeah, it has a capital. Oh, where did it go? Okay, let me save this for you. And it has generated the code behind for it as well. And it has also generated some code. I'll pick it up. I love ReSharper if it works. What is that? Manage country task, right? There it is. So it has also generated the use case in code. So this is the use case in code. And it's called manage country, and it has the addition, the suffix task. Doesn't really matter. It has an init method, and it has continue methods for if you come back from another use case, etc., etc. And it can actually, there's some actions in here, some code, where I can say, okay, if I do this, I'm going to save it, going back to the web page because I'm going to stay on the web page, etc., etc. Save the country, remove the country, basic stuff like this, because that is the way a list detail works. So I'm now going to start up the application. So what I did before you got in is I regenerated the domain object, the table create statement, the factory, the repository, the gateway, stuff like that. I could do it right now again, but since I have only -2 minutes, hopefully it works in one time. So all right, the only thing I didn't do is recreate the table in the database. So what you will see, if it works, if I didn't make any spelling errors or whatever I do, that there's already a record probably in the database. This always takes up too much time. Why don't they do anything about this? At Microsoft, I mean, right? Anybody from Microsoft in the room? Please speed this up the first time you load your application. It always takes a long time. And I have to fill the gap between the time that the things start actually up and the thing that the point in time that I actually click the button. So I tell some jokes in between. I only know jokes about Belgium, so that's what we do in the Netherlands. We make fun of Belgians. And the other way around, in Belgium, they make fun of us, right? So, it's still not here. Oh, there it comes. Right. So I have to log in. Hopefully I remember. Da-di-da-di-da. Okay, here's my application. No matter what it does, it's for an organization that transplants organs. So not the thing you have in the Great Hall, but intestines, right? So here's my use case. I'm just going to fire it up. And this is what we call a list detail. Oh, there's even 2 in the database, right? So I have the Netherlands and Belgium. So it looks like I haven't done anything, but I just recreated the whole thing now, right? So this is basically what it does. I can add a new one, probably. So what are we going to do? We're going to do Scotland, right? I know you will not be independent, but what's the capital anyway? Edinburgh? Right. Just going to save the changes, see what happens. So this is just a very basic example of the power you can actually get from generating code, right? This is of course kid stuff, but we go a long way with this stuff. And it brings us a very high productivity. I'll give you one example to close up with. There was a programming contest last week in the Netherlands. The guys in my team said, oh, you're going to enter the competition. And I was supposed to be in the jury, but since my own team took part in the competition, I couldn't be in the jury anymore. So that was a shame. But they modeled out, for the particular case they got, they had 37 use cases, which is quite a lot. And they had 1.5 days to build them. So they modeled them out as standardized as possible, because that's the thing you now can do. If you know these implementations are behind what you can do, you are actually able to standardize the way the user looks at their application. So I know from a user UX perspective, that's not probably a good way to talk to your client, but it helps save you time, right? So they actually built 37 use cases in 1.5 days, and it took them 15 minutes per point. So that was pretty high. You don't get that in real projects, but it's just a display of saying that you can do stuff really fast, and generating code can give you high quality. So that's basically the message. So I'm not saying use our tools. You can, they're free. I'm just saying think about how you can actually automate stuff in Agile and basically also in waterfall projects. So thank you for indulging me to go like 5 minutes over my time. Well, the conference is nearly done, but still great fun with the rest of the conference and maybe with the workshops tomorrow. And maybe until next year.